All right, thank you. We are back with Ryan and my longtime friend, Mr. Tony Williams of Major Precious Metals. Tony, Ryan, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks again, Joanne. So just for anyone who just walked in, my name is Ryan Hanley. I'm one of the mining analysts at Laurentian Bank Securities, one of the sponsors of the conference. And with me now for a fireside chat, I've got Tony Williams from Major Precious Metals. So maybe, Tony, just if you want to do the usual quick 2-3 minute overview, refresh of the company and kind of what's new over the last little bit.
Okay, good. Well, I'm the chairman and CEO of Major Precious Metals. I'm a mining geologist by background, worked in the industry for many years, worked in investment banking, and I, prior to joining Major Precious Metals, ran a mining venture capital group in London called the Dragon Group, which has been involved in development projects all over the world, former Soviet Union, Africa, South America, etc. I joined Major Precious Metals about a year ago, and I was attracted really by the size of the potential there. We're developing the Skaergaard Project in Greenland, which truly is one of the world's largest PGM resources, certainly outside the traditional producing areas of South Africa and Russia. And it's pretty topical right now because 40% of the world's mined palladium comes from and originates in and is supplied by Russia. There are no sanctions on Norilsk yet, but were that to happen, and I think a lot of feeling in the industry is that might happen when next year's palladium contracts start to be negotiated and sent. The palladium price, which I'll talk about in a moment, I think will certainly go up, and the rise could be quite exponential. The project itself, it's been dormant as a development project for about a decade. It was it's a layered mafic intrusion, without getting too technical, very similar to the Bushveld in South Africa, discovered as an intrusion back in the 1930s, but mineralization was only really recognized in the late 1980s, and it was looked at on and off over the next 2 decades as a gold project. Last drilled in probably the 2009, 2010. We looked at it and saw that, again, like everything, it starts and ends in the market. Gold prices are up. And more importantly, mixed in with the gold content, which is quite significant, are PGMs, and perhaps more significantly, very palladium rich. It's quite unique in its geology that it's a palladium and gold-rich deposit, quite low in nickel, but the simplicity of the precious metal mineralization is quite good because although more work needs to be done, initial metallurgical work, it looks pretty straightforward. Last year, by resampling historical exploration, we were able to file a 43-101 report. And really, I'd just like to emphasize the sheer scale of the opportunity here at Skaergaard. We have close to 20 million palladium equivalent ounces in the 43-101 report, which was filed last May. But perhaps more importantly, in the indicated category, we already have outlined 4 million ounces palladium and 1 million ounces of gold. And where it gets really exciting is you're looking at the inferred category, which is in a stratiform layer, and we felt at the time that the geometry and the widths of the mineralization would be quite consistent. We have a further 10 million ounces of palladium, close to, and another just shy of 4 million ounces of gold. So the sheer scale of the opportunity. So what we did, obviously, we went back in and drilled, and yes, you have a short 5-month season in Greenland, both on the east and the west coast. This is on the east coast of Greenland. But although it's rugged and remote, in mining terms, it's relatively accessible. We operated this year from a specialized boat in the fjord next to the deposit, and with helicopter support, managed, after a pretty slow start, because we're still learning about the logistics, but we started drilling in early August. By the time we demobilized at the end of September, early October, we'd managed to drill over 8,000 meters, new samples with channel sampling, had over 11,000 new samples. That in itself presented a bit of a logistical problem during COVID. We eventually got these in early January to the lab in Ireland, and COVID notwithstanding, the results are now out, and we filed a pretty comprehensive press release on the 9th of June, which is available on the company website. And the results from this are very positive. We've confirmed the geometry, the grades, and the mineralization of the existing mineralization that we'd sampled in the 43-101 report. Perhaps more importantly, 14 new holes actually drilled underneath the glacier, all intersected mineralization. And quite significantly, in my humble opinion, towards the north of the area, where the intrusion flattens out, we have an area called the Northern Plateau. We managed to drill 4 or 5 holes in there, and I'm pleased to say we intersected straight away near-surface mineralization. Now, that's a picture of the rig on the glacier. I say it's remote, it's rugged, but in mining terms, relatively accessible, a 2-hour flight from Western Iceland.
Gotcha. And I mean, you've kind of hit on a couple of different points there. I think maybe one of the questions that comes up, at least for me over the last little bit, is just Greenland.
Yeah.
So I don't think people are as familiar, obviously, compared to places like Canada or Nevada or other parts of the world. How has that been going? There's been a little bit of anti-uranium stuff that's come out in the press lately.
There has, and it was sort of interesting to see on the first 2 talks today with Doug in his eloquent talk about Canada, and then talking about where the hotspots were, for exploration. I can tell you now that the next time we come around to one of these conferences, say in 4 or 5 years' time, Greenland's going to be one of the hotspots. It's all to do with global warming. The retreat of the coastal ice has retreated significantly in the last decade, exposing, quite frankly, pristine geology, which, is just starting to be explored. I think that, as you rightly pointed out, there is some misunderstanding about the attitude of the Greenland government towards mining. There was a large project, really a rare earth project called Kranfeld in the south of the area, on the southwestern coast. Went through feasibility quite happily, but it has a very large uranium content. And look, it's not for me to comment on other people's projects, but there was a big community what's the right word? They didn't like the fact that uranium was going to be mined on their doorstep. The last election was fought on this, and the Inuit Party became the largest party in the coalition government, and have basically said, certainly in the foreseeable future, no uranium mining. I was in Greenland recently, and again, had long discussions with them, as well as at the PDAC last week. And when you speak to them privately, and in some of the public pronouncements that they're now making, it's uranium mining they're against, not mining. And there are several other projects. I can cite the Citron project of ironbark zinc in the far north, the Dundas project of Blue Jay mining, all going through, quite happily, a very clear-cut permitting process. It's a modern mining act, 2009, 2010. Of course, like anywhere in the world, you have to go through the procedures. We have to do our filings. But so far, we've had nothing but support from the government in terms of getting the exploration filings, in filing all the reports that you need to do, and again, going forward. I think that the government now, and it's our advice to them, that they should come out perhaps more publicly on this support for mining, and I think you'll see a lot of that in the next several months. So it's a good point that you've asked me that question, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the attitude of the Greenland government. But I would categorize this as a very favorable geopolitical location. I mean, when you look at where it sits in between Europe and North America, it's perfectly suited to supply minerals. And, there were very flippant comments made by the ex-president about why didn't the U.S. buy Greenland. They did try and buy it in 1946 as well. And now, with the opening of the Arctic Passage, there are lots of, I suppose to use a buzzword, who's going to win the race for Greenland? And I think when we next come to a major conference in the next 2 or 3 years, we'll certainly see Greenland as one of the exploration hotspots in the world. Okay.
And I guess maybe one of the other challenges is just the location of the project. I mean, it's remote being in Greenland. Obviously, there's a lot of projects for various commodities in places like northern Canada, so it's probably a little bit comparable. But what are some of the challenges that you've had to deal with, aside from the usual assay turnaround times?
Well, COVID was the biggest challenge last year. I think it was really understanding what it takes to operate on the rugged east coast of Greenland. It's one good thing, you said we decided to use a ship. We decided to partially use our historical exploration camp there. That worked very well, but I'll be quite honest, it was a slow start. We still managed to get 8,000 meters drilled. What it taught us was that, as I say to my 70-year-old daughter when she's taking exams, the 5 Ps, perfect preparation prevents poor performance. So when we go in next year, we think we need now 2 more full seasons to get to bankable feasibility study. We have a slide up there that says about the next steps. What's happening now, we have these very, very positive drill results that are underpinning an already comprehensive 43-101 report. We've just re-engaged SLR as our independent consultants. They will now take this data, will produce an updated MRE, mineral resource estimate, over the next several weeks. That will then segue into a PEA, preliminary economic analysis, by the end of the year, where we'll put some preliminary economics on the deposit. That will then guide us as to what we need to do to take this along the development cycle to the next step, which is a more detailed feasibility work in the summer season of 2023. So we're really just, it's exploration, but it's not grassroots exploration. You know, we're working off a base of a lot of historical exploration, and this 32-hole program that we completed last season has just gone to underpin the sheer scale of the opportunity that we have.
So is it safe to assume that looking at an updated resource, it's given the huge size of the project, it'll be mostly looking to upgrade inferred to indicate or measured and indicated ounces as
Absolutely.
opposed to step out
I think you know, you should never second guess an independent report, because that's why it's independent. But it will be in the scale of 20 million plus. Plus what? Who knows?
Right.
But the focus will be on then getting that data and wrapping some economics around the project. Because the way we see it, with this near-surface mineralization being intersected on the flat part of the northern plateau, certainly potential is there for starter open pits, which has big implications for the capex for the project. I see this being developed as a stage gate project, where you start with a small open pit, drive a decline from the bottom of the pit, etc., and you build your infrastructure as you go along. And this company certainly has the in-house expertise to take this through the next couple of stages. So it's a huge challenge. I think getting us into proper feasibility work next year on the back of this PEA, you'll hear a lot more about this deposit. Not only hear more about Greenland, but I think also in the geopolitical context of what's happening in the PGM market, you know, we're in the right place at the right time, and we think we have the right people.
Okay. And you mentioned having a starter open pit. In terms of looking at the deposit overall, and I think you might have had a slide on this, looking at continuity, because you've got several layers of, I think, going from more PG-rich material to more gold material.
Yeah.
How do you kind of envision looking at that? Is it something you kind of go after all at once, or do you have to separate the...
I haven't got the right slide there, but no, this will be, the first stage of the PEA will be predicated on looking at the precious metal mineralization. Just as it is in the Bushveld, the whole mineralized package is about 45 meters thick. 3 main horizons of precious metal mineralization, one of which is very gold rich, one of which is more palladium rich, and an intermediate zone, gold and palladium in the middle. So those will be modeled independently, and we'll come up with a palladium and gold and platinum resource. Okay. But overlapping and spanning these zones are intermediate zones of lower grade palladium and gold, but with related iron titanium oxide mineralization containing things like vanadium and gallium, etc. So preliminary metallurgical work thinks we can also recover what I've described as a VTM, a vanadium titanium magnetite concentrate, which would only add to rock value. Now, we need to look at this a lot more carefully, and in certain parts of the deposit, we'll be looking at a bulk mining technique, certainly if the grades hold up for these additional projects. But it doesn't need those additional rock value to make it. It's very palladium rich and very gold rich, and we think we now have near surface mineralization that we hope with the mining studies that come along will be demonstrated to be open pittable.
Is it, I guess, looking at other metals, like whether it be titanium or vanadium, I guess it's a bit more secondary, because I'm assuming you don't want to distract from the main PGM component or overcomplicate things.
But it's very useful to have, because in going, you know, certainly, you know, you're looking at a 2-meter minimum mining width, so you'd be taking in some of the narrower areas. The horizons range between, on average, 1 to 3 meters, although there are much thicker parts of the deposit where you might be able to go in for bulk mining. That'll all be part of the PEA. But I have to say, it's not grassroots. This is a huge world-class resource that, quite frankly, has slipped under the radar for the last decade or so. people have heard of the Skaergaard deposit, but there are very few people realize, A, the type of mineralization, the palladium-rich nature of the resource, which incidentally is 100% owned by the company, and the fact that we can now quite quickly go to a development phase, or certainly to the bankable feasibility phase over the next, let's say, 18 months or so.
Okay. And I mean, that was kind of one of my other questions as well, is that Skaergaard, I think, has been around for quite some time. There's a lot of academic research on it. There's a lot of studies that have been done. Why now? What's changed?
I mean, again, without being too flippant, it all starts and ends in the market. We saw last year, because of even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw palladium prices peak because of problems in South Africa with electrical outages and problems at Norilsk, where there was, because of permafrost, there was a collapse, there was an inrush of water into the palladium price went to $3,000 an ounce, just like that. I mean, it's pulled back now. It's trading in the range of between $1,800 and $2,000 an ounce. In my opinion, it's being held back quite significantly by all the supply shortages in the automobile industry, with the chip shortage that's not only affecting automobiles, but other catalytic converter uses for palladium. And notwithstanding what happens in Russia, I think over the next 12, 18 months, as the supply chains in the automobile industry come back to normal, I think we'll see renewed strength in the palladium market, because, again, palladium's main use is in catalytic converters, and although we all recognize there will be growing EV penetration over the next decade, hybrids are going to be there as well as an interim, and in our opinion, we won't see the growth as quickly as some people are predicting, but in any event, hybrids are a very important use of palladium. So I think that palladium is categorized as a green energy metal. I think the demand curve for palladium is set fair over the next decade.
Oh, fair. And then I guess maybe just as we wrap up here, one of the questions I've asked the last few presenters is just really, with a huge variety of exploration companies that are out there, what differentiates Major Precious? Usually I give people a hard time when they say valuation, but at less than $1 an ounce, I'll give you a bit of a pass. But
what I would say is this. I mean, we always say the best deals are done on beer mats in pubs. Okay? We have a market cap there of just over 22 million, 23 million Canadian, which is less than 18 million US right now. We already have 20 million palladium equivalent ounces. So in the ground, we're trading at less than $1 an ounce of precious metal equivalent, with upside and, more importantly, this is not pie-in-the-sky development. I mean, we're working now towards an updated MRE based on 2021 assay results, leading to a PEA, which will lead to the next development phase. So I'm afraid to say it is valuation. And all this is being done in the context, if you want to be geopolitical about it, of 40% of the world's mined palladium originating in and being supplied by Russia. And I'm sure that next year, when the annual contracts come to be renegotiated for Norilsk, who knows what the geopolitical situation will be. The demand is set fair anyway, but when you've got 40% of a relatively niche market, I mean, the whole market for palladium worldwide is only about 10 million ounces, 7 million mined, largely in South Africa and Russia, and about 3 million from the recycling business. So it's a niche market anyway. So I'm afraid the answer is valuation,
Fair.
Valuation, and valuation.
Fair. Perfect. Joanne, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, do we have any questions from the audience? Gabe? And I have a question too. So once you're done with Terry, I'll ask a question.
Thanks, Tony. Good to see you, Tony.
Hi, Terry.
You mentioned about the contracts coming off next year with Norilsk and everybody else, I assume.
Yeah.
So what happens with Norilsk with the sanctions?
Well, it's surprising. Yeah, I can't understand why, if you put it in the context of other oligarchs, the oligarch who owns 60% of Norilsk, or no nickel, is Mr. Potanin, Mr. Vladimir Potanin, and he's the only one of the top 15, 20 so-called Mr. Putin's inner circle who hasn't been sanctioned. So I think there will be sanctions coming. I really do. Well, I think it depends what happens I'm just a simple geologist, okay? You know, I mean, I'm not going to try and second guess what's happening there, but it's inevitable. It's inevitable. And 40% of the world's mined palladium comes from Norilsk. I mean, it's relatively an inelastic market because most of the palladium, both in Norilsk and in South Africa, is mined as a byproduct. I mean, a byproduct of platinum in South Africa and of nickel in Norilsk. So they're going to produce the palladium, but will they be able to sell it? And we saw with in retrospect, the relatively small supply disruptions when there was the flooding at Norilsk and then the power outages in South Africa, we saw what happened to the palladium price. Bang, $3,000 an ounce. So, fundamentally, we're in good shape and we're in a good geopolitical location with the project, as we see on the investment value proposition, that it speaks for itself. It's a tier 1 location. We have an advanced, well-documented, large, globally significant palladium and gold resource.
Perfect.
Coming back to Greenland and Denmark, it would be really helpful if they have a position whereby they will make Greenland and also mining a priority as a statement instead of people getting confused about it, as you said earlier, uranium versus uranium mining.
It's a bit of a frustration, but and again, if these remarks might be recorded, and I'm sure that my friends in Greenland will look at them. So, I don't want to be overly critical because it's a young government. I mean, the Prime Minister's 35 years old, the Minister of Mines 36 years old. The Minister of Justice and Business, Mrs. Natha Nielsen, who's an extremely articulate lady, is 38 years old. I mean, they're learning on the job. So I think our job as an industry is to go to them and say, look, we respect your decision on uranium. That's not for us to comment. You've stood on an election platform and got elected as the largest party on that. But you say you want sustainable mining. We had an ESG slide. We're all meeting the towards sustainable mining protocols of the Canadian government. We're working, luckily, with SLR. They have a very strong ESG presence within the firm. So everything we do, and as we move into PEA, as everyone here will say, is with a cognizance about ESG. But it would be helpful, Terry, I think you're quite correct, if people are talking to the government, to say, come out with a little bit more, not transparency is the wrong word, but a little bit more often, statements more often about the support for sustainable mining projects.
Perfect. I think that takes us, we're probably a little bit over time here.
Yeah, I did have one question, which is quite interesting. This is a discovery that was made about 10 years ago, and now with global warming, the discovery has been rediscovered. And maybe, Tony, you can talk a little bit about the difference in the deposit 10 years ago.
Yeah, well,
what we're seeing now.
I mean, again, there was more ice. Okay, there was more ice. Now there's less ice, and what that's done, a lot of these areas that weren't drillable before, because of the logistics and what have you, are now drillable. And this is why we've been able to get up onto the top of the glacier, drill 14 holes, which show the continuity of the stratiform mineralization. It dips about 20 degrees to the south, but it's stratiform going north. We've demonstrated the continuity of the mineralization. We've demonstrated, albeit in a preliminary fashion, the potential for open pit mining in areas that had previously not been drilled. Why weren't they drilled? Nothing to do with the competence of the geologists that were there before. It wasn't accessible. Now it's accessible, and in the next 5 years, it'll be even more accessible.
All right.
This is a big deposit. It goes down to 4 kilometers. It's only been drilled to 900 meters. And just as one last comment, in the Bushveld, I mean, it's a different geological age to the Bushveld, but there are many similarities. Bushveld was discovered by Hans Morenski in 1924. Since then, there have been 34 separate mines developed on the Bushveld complex. So we're in the infancy here with Skaergaard, and hopefully we'll be number one.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you for supporting me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tony.